Thankfully, there's been a lot of discussion about survivability in Diablo 4, the stats that you need, how resistances work, how damage reduction works, and all of that. And that's fantastic because I really think that people don't necessarily understand just how important survivability stats are in this game, and the fact that every build that's going to try to push endgame content and high Nightmare Dungeon content is basically going to prioritize survivability across every single stat that they possibly can. Now, the particular topic that I wanted to talk about today is resistances, because right now there's a little bit of confusion about how it works, and I promise you it's actually pretty simple. There's not a lot going on here, but there are some incredibly important nuances that you need to understand so that you can properly stat out your character. Now, I'm a level 89 Necromancer. That means that I'm a high intelligence based class, and you'll see that just from my stats alone, I gain 28% all resistances to everything that isn't physical. And you'll notice that my resistances are really high, right? I'm near 81% resistant against cold damage, etc. My resistances are absolutely through the roof. Now, that's actually just because of the world difficulty that I'm on, but we'll talk about that in a quick second. The big thing here is that you'll notice that I don't really put resistances on any piece of gear that isn't actually just my rings and amulet, because the rings and amulet are easily your best source of resistances in this game. The amulet just says all resistance. Each ring will have 2 big amounts of resistances to 2 of the different elemental types, and that basically means that you're all set. But I know recently you might be thinking, well, what about the fact that putting on a ton of resistances doesn't get my character anything? Well, it's actually kind of simple. It's just diminishing returns. Now, for that to make sense, let's go back down to a much lower level character. So I'm on a level 8 Necromancer right now. I only have 85 intelligence, and that means that that is currently contributing 4.2% to my all res. And if you go look at all my resistances, I have 4.2 across the board. This is fantastic, right? Let's go ahead and toss on a piece of gear that has additional resistances and see what it looks like. So right here, I have boots that give me 6 lightning resistance. That means 4.2 plus 6 should get me 10.2 resistance. But when I toss it on, you'll notice that I only get 10% resistance. And while a lot of things in the character sheet are just lying due to like rounding issues or not necessarily calculating everything correctly, this one's pretty spot on. What we currently are experiencing is diminishing returns. And if you wanted to have the number, the difference between what we should be getting here and what we are actually getting here is only 98.03% effective resistance. So if you come from Diablo 2, you'll remember that Magic Find has diminishing returns. The more you put in, the less that you get out. It works the exact same way here for all of our damage reduction types. It works for resistances, works for armor, it works for straight up damage reduction on our stats. Everything has diminishing returns. And what it means is that stacking up to 100% effective resistance is effectively impossible, because no character is going to be completely immune to any damage type unless you literally have a skill that says that you become immune, and those are typically very limited. Now, another great example here is the fact that on the Necromancer, we also have the Skeletal Defenders. And if you sacrifice your Skeletal Defenders, you're supposed to gain 15% to all resistances across the board. So if I go ahead and do that right now, my 4.2 plus my 15 should give me 19.2, and we can go ahead and look at what we actually get, and it's only 18.6. So if I were to chart that out onto my little data sheet here, our resistances have become 96.8% effective. So we're only getting 96% of the total res that we should get, whereas previously we were getting 98% resistance, and before that we were getting 100% resistance. So you see how our effective resistance is becoming smaller and smaller and smaller the more that we put on. And then just as a last data point here, I have my 18.6 res here, throw in another 6% lightning res, that should get me up to 24.6 if there were no diminishing returns, and instead only gets me up to 23.5, which that one puts us at 0.962% effective if I'm reading my chart right here. So again, you just see that the numbers are getting smaller and smaller. But what about my Necromancer that I just showed you before, where she had 80% resistance to cold? How is that even possible? Well, that has to deal with world difficulty. If you were to go read the world tier statue when you're selecting the different difficulties in the game, you'll notice that Nightmare says that monsters overcome 20% resistance. So if I were to just go look at my character really quickly and take a random number, I currently have 81.3% cold resistance. Let's go ahead and swap over to Nightmare difficulty and check what it shows us there. So now you'll see we only have 65% resistance to cold, whereas previously it was 81.3. And if I just do the math very quickly, if I take that number and I divide it by the other number, that is effectively losing 20% of our resistance. So spot on, the statue is doing exactly what it says it's doing. And it goes even further when you dump into Torment level. Torment says that monsters overcome 40% of our total resistance. And let's just make sure that the stats aren't lying here. Cold res is down to 48.7, and if I were to take that number and just do the math, take that number, divide it out, we are losing 40% of our total resistance because we are in world difficulty 4. So at least that part is working straight across the board. It's just a 40% reduction. Now I'm going to show you a chart very quickly. Understand the fact that I don't have enough data points for the chart to be as beautiful as it should be, but I'll highlight the curve that you need to be looking at. I took my total resistance amounts that I should have at various points. This was including things like the Paragon board, sacrificing our defenders, having Memento Mori, increasing my sacrifice values, etc. For non-Necromancer players, basically just a stat that says I get more out of these when I do this. And the chart shows what you expect from diminishing returns. There's going to be a couple gaps, but it's a curve that kind of goes like this, never quite approaching the total effective amount and getting less and less and less as you go. We have a pretty simple chart here. We have the total amount of resistances that we have on our character, and then we have the actual resistances in our character sheet. And then what you see next to that is the effective rate. So this is at 161 total resistance. I'm actually only getting 31% of that value to get to my 50.4. And while our total resistance increases in a linear path here, you notice that our actual resistances, not only are they much smaller, but actually have a curve to them. Again, it has a diminishing return. It has a curve. It's going to get closer and closer and closer and closer to a maximum that it will never quite reach due to diminishing returns. Now, I just wanted to point out another thing, because the culprit here isn't just resistances and it isn't just armor. It's all forms of damage reduction in the game. So I have a pair of pants that say 17.1 damage reduction from distant. And if I were to go look at my damage reduction from distant enemies, I currently have 39.3%. So if there were no diminishing returns, 39.3 plus 17.1 puts you at 56.4. And when I put this on, you'll notice that only brings us up to 49.6. Every type of percentage-based damage reduction in this game, whether it's your resistances, armor, or just straight up damage reduction itself, all have diminishing returns. The developers have made the game in such a way so that you cannot become immune by the accumulation of too much damage reduction. So what it means is that as long as the amount of damage that's incoming doesn't get reduced down below a single integer of 1, you're going to take some amount of damage from all sources. And that's a pretty good thing. We really don't want this game to be a bunch of immune characters just running around not taking any damage at all, because while that's fun, it ultimately means that the balance is broken, the meta is broken, and the endgame content wouldn't actually give us a challenge. Now, the other important thing to note here, which I'm trying to highlight as many times as I can, is on top of all of this, monsters also deal increasing amounts of damage to the character whenever they're higher level. During one of the developer updates, they actually showed the chart for your effective damage reduction versus a target as that target's level increases. And this is why in my most recent video, I wanted to highlight high Nightmare Dungeon levels, because starting at level 47, like a Nightmare Dungeon level 47, monsters are above level 100. And since we can only reach level 100, every tier dungeon higher than that adds an additional level to the total. Meaning that there's an eventual point where monsters are 50 levels higher than you and there's nothing that you can do about it. So your resistances are going to count for even less against them. There's never going to be a point where you're completely immune. What is your takeaway though? Because all this is very good, and if you understand diminishing returns, you basically didn't need to watch the video in the first place. Congratulations. I'm sorry for wasting your time. But for people who are wondering about how to stack survivability, this really isn't a bad thing. Let's take the example of intelligence-based classes like the Necromancer. Since I have int, I'm going to gain all elemental resistances. That means between just my intelligence here and just my amulet, if I were to put a royal diamond in it, which also gives you all resistance, it basically means I wouldn't need resistances on any other piece of my gear. I wouldn't need to put it on my armor, my helmet, my pants, or anything. I even have some resistances on these boots right now, which are effectively completely useless. They say they give me 25.5 cold res. My cold res right now is 48.7. I take them off and I only drop down to 44.9. Now, I want to make this very clear. Adding on 3 or 4 damage reduction to your character against any source of damage is a huge amount of survivability. When I say useless here, I more so mean that it is not optimal for me to worry about putting resistances on these pieces of gear, because your rings already do that for you as well as your amulet. The amulet gives you all resistances, your rings give you huge amounts to 2 different resistances, and while you've probably been ignoring these the entire time, if you were to get one ring that has fire and cold res, and then another ring that has lightning and poison or shadow resistance, you probably don't need res across the rest of your board. What that also means is that Paragon nodes like this one right here are a lot less valuable or a lot less important to route to than you might think. This node right here is giving me 15.6 all resistance. If I were to drop this node and go look at my character sheet, while I have definitely taken a hit, do not get it twisted. You shouldn't completely deprioritize resistances. The amount that it drops by isn't as much as you think. So 37.7 here, toss that back in, and I'm up to 41.4, so that 15 all res got me roughly 4% resistance. It's definitely true to say that adding on armor is typically stronger than elemental resistances, and that's because armor not only contributes half of its value to your elemental resistances, but it also gives you physical damage reduction. So really what your takeaway here is, especially on intelligence classes, is 1, you probably don't need to worry about elemental resistances as much as you have been. I still think that you should strive to get as close to 50% resistances across the board for elemental, but if you're really worrying about putting in another 50 or 100 total resistances on your armor pieces here, it's probably not worth your while. And what it means for non-intelligence based classes, while you may want to put skulls into your amulets and rings, because that's going to get you the physical damage reduction as well as the elemental damage reduction, you may already be fine on armor, and you should actually be swapping in diamonds here so you can get these non-physical types of damage reduction. And while it personally helped me on the Necromancer to understand is that while initially this Book of the Dead resistance bump here from sacrificing defenders is pretty good for survivability, the return that I get on it is typically so small in the end game that I should really prioritize getting additional damage or additional crit on my build, and that means that I can free up other slots. If I want to put more armor on, then I could select this one. I'm able to mix and match what I want to get all of my resistances as close to 50% as I can. There you go. I hope that that helps. The quick summary is there's just diminishing returns on resistances. The game doesn't want you to become immune to everything, and realistically getting as many numbers as close to 50% total damage reduction as possible will mean that all of the incoming damage that you're dealing with is as manageable as it can possibly be. And then on top of your armor and your resistances, you really need to prioritize stacking sources of damage reduction on your gear as your most important survivability tool, on top of your maximum life and sources of fortify or barrier. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope that didn't confuse you in any way, but if it did, let me know down in the comments. If you have more questions or things that I can try to clear up for you, I'd really appreciate knowing so that more people can have more information, meaning that they're making better informed decisions and everybody is having a more fun time playing this game and not getting one-tapped by random stuff. But again, thank you so much for listening. If you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.